quite interesting, or very, very interesting what you just said. I mean, one of the question I wanted to ask you as well is this, you mentioned about this interesting lack of the non-existence of election. Do you actually know why there hasn't been an election for nearly, is it 20, 17 years, nearly 17, 18 years? That is incredible.
I think the simple answer is Hamas do not want to put it to the test. So Hamas seized power in 2007, and I don't think they are inclined to put their mandate to a popular test. Now, I suspect that within Gaza, there is, if you could do decent opinion polls, there would be a relatively large area of support for Hamas, simply born out of desperation, anger, frustration, but also because in many ways Hamas controls everything in Gaza. Most of the finances of Gaza are provided by Qatar. They provide the economic input to Gaza to keep it going, but it's Hamas who are the major employer. It's Hamas who run the health service. It's Hamas who run the education service. It's Hamas basically who decides who earns what and who gets money. So to some extent, everybody who lives in Gaza is dependent on Hamas, whether they like Hamas or not. And I suspect at the same time, the lack of progress towards peace, the lack of progress towards the two-state solution has no doubt, as these things do, tended to have fed anger and frustration. Now, that does not in any way justify terroristic attacks. Absolutely not. But these things have their causes, and the tragedy is that for many young Palestinians, no doubt, anger and frustration has led them to support Hamas. But I must stress there has been no actual democratic test of that support since 2006. So the simple matter is we don't know what Palestinians would vote today if they had the right to do so, and Hamas are not about to give them that opportunity either. But if there is support for Hamas, it is certainly born out of despair, unemployment, and anger, and that's what needs to be addressed. That doesn't excuse terrible things done, but we need to know the reasons for things in order to try to cut them off at the source, if you see what I mean.
I mean, that's been one of the very strong message, I would say, from the Prime Minister of Israel to really kind of eradicate Hamas completely. Now, I have another question, which is really in relation to this, and obviously, we have seen many conflicts in Israel over the last 10, 20 years, pretty much. But it sounds to me something a little bit different, compared to other conflict that we have, all the terrorist attack that we have from Hamas. I mean, you mentioned about this provocation. Now, what about the Arab country, the Arab country which is surrounding Israel? What's their take on this?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I think, because when October the 7th happened, as well as being horrified by what's happening to human beings, Israeli citizens, men, women, and children, the other question was, what do Hamas want to gain from this? What is their end game? I mean, in one sense, it's an outburst of hatred against Israel, but clearly it's more than that. This was planned for months, if not years, and I think the clear aim of Hamas was to trigger a regional conflict, because although the official money coming in that keeps Gaza going comes from Qatar, the leadership of Hamas are heavily beholden to Iran in terms of logistical and ideological support, in the same way that Iran gives a great deal of support and basically has as a proxy organization Hezbollah, very significant in southern Lebanon, threatening Israel's border. So the Iranians have become the major suppliers, the major ideological support of Hamas in Gaza. And I think the end game that they had in mind was that this would in fact kick off a regional conflict, that it would stop the rapprochements which have happened over the last 4 or 5 years between Israel and the Gulf states and other surrounding states. There was due to be a normalizing of relationships, had it worked, between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I have no doubt that one of the factors behind the Hamas attack, the timing of it, was to try to destroy those increasingly constructive relationships which have been developing between Israel and the other Arab states. And it is interesting to note that although there has been distress, anger and outrage expressed in surrounding Arab countries at the high level of civilian casualties, which have been very, very high in this campaign against Hamas, shockingly high, nevertheless, they have stepped back from anything approaching conflict with Israel. So I think Hamas have failed in their aim because they have not kick-started a regional war, which no doubt the Iranians would also have been quite happy to have seen kicked off, because they would have seen that as a way of perhaps increasing their bargaining power in the area where they already have very tense relationships with Saudi Arabia, very tense relationships with Gulf states. And I have no doubt that Iran hoped that in a regional conflict, they would emerge as a significant player out of the chaos and wreckage. Now, that hasn't happened because Egypt, Jordan, Syria, obviously in a chaotic state, have not reacted in a warlike way towards Israel. And I think that has basically been a failure of the Hamas plan. I think they wanted that. They wanted an apocalyptic regional conflict, but they've not managed to do so because these other states are not willing to play that game.
That's very interesting. Finally, it's such a sort of fascinating. We talked about Israel and what's going on, and really, as you mentioned, this failed attempt to create a regional kind of conflict. When I read this article in my head, I was thinking Ezekiel 38. When you got all the Arab country gathering together to really invade Israel in that sense, and obviously that is a Bible prophecy. We know that it is bound to happen at some stage. Do you think that we are getting closer and closer, even though that's been, in a way, a failed attempt by Hamas to actually gather the other Arab country to kind of rise up against Israel? Or do you think that we're actually still getting closer, that eventually, obviously it's a Bible prophecy, so we know it will happen, but do you feel that we're actually much more closer than we were maybe a year or 2 years ago?
Strange enough, I would actually answer no, that I would say the kind of pan-Arab military operations against Israel that we saw in 1948 in the war at the establishment of the State of Israel, that we saw preceding the 1967 Six-Day War when Israel struck first, as we saw in the Yom Kippur War, people will remember, in 1973, I do not think we have those kind of situation emerging now. I think that increasingly Arab states are exhausted by this ongoing conflict, and I think they are wanting to have a greater degree of normalization with Israel. And I think the feeling that they were being sidelined, the Palestinians that is, the feeling that they were no longer significant enough of a priority to other states from the Palestinian perspective, I suspect drove Hamas to these appalling and desperate measures. So I would actually argue that although it looks apocalyptic in the Middle East at the moment, that actually we are much further away from a pan-Arab Israel war, much further away from it than we were in 1973 or 1967 or 1948, because the states around Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon for that matter, are certainly not countenancing armed conflict against Israel. So I do not think we are in that situation. It looks apocalyptic because of the suffering of individual people and communities, and that is appalling. But in terms of the juxtaposition of different states and their positions, they are in a very different position now because there is now more of a drive to normalize relations with Israel. And I think that sparked the Hamas actions as much as anything else. They wanted to derail that. They wanted to derail that normalization.
Wonderful. Martin, thank you so much. That's been so insightful, and hopefully you'll be able to answer some of our other questions in this matter. So we shall catch up with you a bit later on during the show. We're going to continue and pursue